Eleanor Mitchell froze at her kitchen window, coffee mug suspended mid-air, eyes fixed on the massive black bear sitting motionless on her snow-covered porch. It wasn't aggressive or searching for food. It was staring directly at her, with an unsettling intelligence behind its amber eyes. "Dear Lord," Margaret gasped beside her, stumbling backward and knocking over a chair with a crash that echoed through the silent cabin. "Ellie, get away from the window before it charges." Eleanor's arthritic fingers trembled around the mug as she noticed the bear's right ear, oddly scarred, triggering a memory she couldn't quite grasp, like an old photograph faded with time. "Call the sheriff," Margaret commanded, already fumbling for her phone, face drained of color. How long would this creature wait? And what could it possibly want from a 72-year-old widow living alone in the Montana wilderness? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor Mitchell had lived in her cabin nestled in the mountains outside Whitefish, Montana for 47 years. It was the home she and Frank had built with their own hands back in 1978, when they were young, hopeful, and believed they had all the time in the world. That was before the arthritis had gnarled her once nimble fingers, before Frank's heart had given out on a snowy morning 5 winters ago, and long before Social Security and a modest pension had become insufficient to keep up with property taxes and heating bills. The cabin sat on 15 acres of woodland that backed up against national forest land, creating an unbroken corridor of wilderness that stretched for miles. In better days, that location had been perfect for Eleanor's work as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist. For 30 years, she had nursed injured animals back to health, everything from orphaned fawns to injured hawks, before releasing them back into the wild. It had given her life purpose, especially after learning she and Frank couldn't have children of their own. "You shouldn't be living out here alone at your age," Margaret said now, her voice tight with concern as she peered cautiously out the window at the bear that remained stubbornly on Eleanor's porch. "What if you fall? What if your car breaks down in a snowstorm? And now there's a bear that seems to have chosen your house as its personal territory." Eleanor sighed, absently running her hand over the worn fabric of Frank's favorite armchair. She still couldn't bring herself to get rid of it, though the upholstery was fraying at the seams. "I'm not going to some sterile retirement community in Florida, Maggie. This is my home." Margaret had been Eleanor's best friend since their college days at Montana State. She lived in town now, in a tidy condo with no maintenance worries, and made the 20-minute drive up the mountain road to check on Eleanor twice a week, more often when winter storms threatened. "Sheriff Jenkins said he'll send Deputy Carson out to assess the situation," Margaret said, putting her phone away. "But with this snowstorm, it might take him a while to get here." Outside, the January wind howled around the eaves of the cabin, driving fresh snow against the windows. The temperature had plummeted overnight to 15 below zero, brutal even by Montana standards. Eleanor couldn't help wondering how the bear was surviving in such conditions. Black bears typically denned during winter months, their metabolism slowing to a crawl as they lived off fat reserves until spring. Yet this one sat alert on her porch, as if waiting for something. "Did you leave food out?" Margaret asked. "Anything that might have attracted it?" Eleanor shook her head. "I know better than that. Been living with wildlife long enough to know the rules." Deputy Carson's truck pulled up to Eleanor's cabin just before noon, its tires crunching on the frozen snow. The bear had maintained its vigil for nearly 5 hours. Occasionally shifting position but never straying more than a few feet from the porch steps. Eleanor watched from the window as the young deputy cautiously exited his vehicle, one hand resting on his holespin. "Ma'am," he called out, his breath visible in the frigid air. "I need you to stay inside. I'm going to try to scare it off." Eleanor felt a sudden protectiveness she couldn't explain. "Don't shoot it," she called back through the door. "It's not being aggressive." The deputy approached slowly, making himself look large as wildlife management training dictated. The bear turned its massive head toward him but didn't rise or show any signs of aggression. It simply watched, with what Eleanor could only describe as patience. "That's not normal behavior," Margaret whispered beside her. "Bears should either run or charge when threatened." Deputy Carson seemed to agree. After several attempts to intimidate the animal with loud noises and threatening gestures, all met with the same impassive stare, he retreated to his vehicle and made a call. "Wildlife Services is sending someone," he reported when Eleanor cracked the door open. "But with the storm, it might be tomorrow before they get here. In the meantime, stay inside and don't open your doors or windows." After the deputy left, promising to check back the next day, Eleanor found herself drawn to the window again. The bear had settled back into its original position, seemingly undisturbed by the entire interaction. "I should stay the night," Margaret said firmly. "I don't like leaving you alone with that thing out there." Eleanor shook her head. "The road will be impassable soon with this snow. You need to get back to town while you still can." She glanced at her friend's sensible but city-oriented SUV. "I've got plenty of food, my generator if the power goes out, and that thing hasn't shown any interest in breaking in. I'll be fine." Margaret reluctantly agreed, but only after extracting a promise that Eleanor would call every few hours to confirm her safety. As dusk fell and the storm intensified, Eleanor sat in Frank's old armchair by the fireplace, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders. The temperature outside had dropped further, and the wind howled mournfully around the eaves. She couldn't stop thinking about the bear, sitting in the brutal cold on her porch. "What do you want?" she whispered to herself, peering through the curtains at the dark shape still visible through the swirling snow. That night, Eleanor slept fitfully, waking every few hours to check if the bear had finally given up and sought shelter. But each time she looked, the animal remained, occasionally shaking off the accumulating snow but otherwise motionless. By morning, nearly 18 inches of fresh powder had fallen, and the bear was partially buried, a dark island in a sea of white. Eleanor called Margaret as promised, then Sheriff Jenkins directly, asking when Wildlife Services would arrive. "Roads are closed, Ellie," the sheriff said, his voice crackling over the spotty connection. "Nobody's getting up there today. Is the bear still there?" "Yes," she confirmed, watching as the creature slowly stood and shook itself, displacing a small avalanche of snow from its thick fur. "Tom, something's not right. This isn't normal bear behavior." "Which is exactly why you need to stay inside and away from it," the sheriff replied firmly. "Bears that act abnormally are unpredictable. Promise me you won't do anything foolish." Eleanor agreed, but as she hung up, she felt a growing certainty that the bear was trying to communicate something to her. It was the same feeling she'd had many times during her years of wildlife rehabilitation. An intuition that had rarely led her astray. By the third day, word had spread through Whitefish about Eleanor Mitchell's bear. Local news had picked up the story, reporting that an elderly woman was besieged in her mountain cabin by a persistent black bear that refused to leave. The dramatic framing irritated Eleanor, especially when they quoted Robert Hoffman, the local hunting guide, saying that the animal should be put down immediately for exhibiting such unusual behavior. "Probably rabid or brain damaged," Hoffman told the reporter. "Either way, it's a threat to the community." Eleanor had never liked Hoffman, who seemed to view wildlife as either trophies or nuisances. His hunting guide service catered to wealthy out-of-staters looking for an authentic Montana experience, which too often meant killing the largest animal they could find for a photograph and bragging rights. The storm finally broke on the afternoon of the third day, leaving behind a crystalline blue sky and temperatures that, while still well below freezing, were mild enough for the county to begin clearing the mountain roads. Eleanor knew Wildlife Services would arrive soon. and with them would likely come a death sentence for the bear. As she made her coffee that morning, Eleanor found herself talking aloud to the animal, something she'd begun doing over the past days of shared isolation. "They're coming to take you away today," she said softly, looking through the kitchen window at the bear. "Why won't you just go? Save yourself?" The bear's eyes met hers through the glass, and Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. There was recognition there, intelligence, purpose. This wasn't just a confused animal or random behavior. It was waiting for something or someone. And in that moment, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She would find out what the bear wanted, even if it meant defying the authorities, her friends, and perhaps common sense itself. What she didn't know was that this decision would uncover a mystery that had begun 7 years earlier, reconnect her with a past she thought long behind her, and ultimately save not just the bear's life, but her own as well. Eleanor watched the Wildlife Services truck struggling up her driveway, its chains clanking against the snow-packed road. The sight filled her with dread. She'd spent the last hour gathering courage for what she was about to do, and now time had run out. Before the truck could reach the cabin, she unbolted her door and stepped onto the porch. The bear, which had been lying down, immediately rose to its full height, a good 6 feet tall when standing on its hind legs. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain still. At 72, she'd lived a full life, and some risks were worth taking. "What is it?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "What do you want from me?" The bear dropped to all fours and took a step toward her. Eleanor held her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to retreat. Then, to her astonishment, the bear turned and walked to the side of the porch, looking back at her expectantly. When she didn't move, it returned, gently nudged her hand with its nose, a touch so delicate it belied the creature's enormous strength, then moved again to the side of the cabin it wanted her to follow. "Eleanor Mitchell, get back inside immediately!" A man's voice rang out from the approaching vehicle. The wildlife officer had spotted her and was now rushing toward the cabin, tranquilizer gun in hand. "Wait," Eleanor called back. "He's not threatening me. He wants to show me something." "Ma'am, that's not possible. Bears don't show humans anything. Please, get inside where it's safe." But Eleanor had already made her decision. Ignoring the officer's protests, she carefully descended the porch steps and followed the bear, which was now moving along the perimeter of her cabin toward the storm cellar entrance at the back. The bear stopped at the old wooden doors that led to the cellar, a space Eleanor rarely used anymore since her knees made the steep stairs difficult to navigate. The animal pawed at the snow covering the doors, then looked at her with what she could only interpret as desperation. "You want me to open the cellar?" she asked, inching closer. The bear backed away, giving her space. With trembling hands, Eleanor brushed away the snow and grasped the iron handle, pulling up one of the heavy wooden doors. The bear immediately moved forward, peering into the darkness below. "Ma'am, step away from the animal." The wildlife officer was approaching cautiously, his tranquilizer gun raised. "There's something down there," Eleanor called back. "Something he wants me to see." She pulled a small flashlight from her coat pocket, a habit from years of power outages, and shined it down into the darkness. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar concrete steps leading down to the dirt floor where she stored preserved foods and old furniture. Then she heard it, a faint whimpering sound coming from the far corner. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "There's something alive down there." "Ms. Mitchell, please." The officer was closer now, his voice tense with concern. "I'm going down to look," she said firmly, already lowering herself onto the first step. "At least let me go first," the officer said, seemingly recognizing the futility of arguing with her. "My name's David Wilson, by the way. I specialize in bear management." Together they descended into the cellar, the bear watching anxiously from above. Eleanor's flashlight beam swept across the cluttered space until it landed on movement in the far corner. There, nestled among old blankets that had been stored in a trunk, were 3 tiny bear cubs. "Oh, my God," Wilson whispered, lowering his weapon. Cubs. In January. The tiny creatures were huddled together for warmth, their eyes barely open, fur still showing the fuzzy texture of newborns. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. "That's why he's been waiting," Eleanor said, her voice filled with wonder. "He's been guarding them." "This doesn't make sense," Wilson said, shaking his head in confusion. "Male bears don't care for cubs. In fact, they often kill them. And bears this young should be denning with their mother." As if in answer, one of the cubs let out a pitiful cry. The bear above growled softly in response. Eleanor's mind raced, piecing together the impossible puzzle. The mother must be dead, and somehow he's taken responsibility for them. She looked up at the massive bear, now seeing him in an entirely new light. "But how did they get in here?" Wilson knelt to examine the cubs more closely. "They're malnourished and dehydrated. They need medical attention right away." As Eleanor watched the tiny creatures struggling weakly in their makeshift nest, a memory surfaced, something that had been nagging at her subconscious since she first saw the bear on her porch. "The scar on his ear," she whispered. "I know this bear." Wilson looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" "7 years ago, I rehabilitated a bear cub with an injured ear. It had been caught in barbed wire on a ranch about 10 miles from here." Eleanor's voice trembled with emotion. "I kept him for almost 3 months before releasing him back into the wild." "That's highly unlikely," Wilson said, though doubt had crept into his voice. "Bears don't remember humans that way." But Eleanor was no longer listening. She was thinking of the small cub she had nursed back to health all those years ago, how it had slept, curled against her, how it had followed her around like a puppy, how heartbroken she had been when it was time to let it go. She remembered the distinctive tear in its right ear that had never fully healed, leaving a visible notch. "It's him," she said with certainty. "He remembered me, and when these cubs needed help, he brought them to the only human he trusted." While Wilson radioed for veterinary assistance, Eleanor carefully gathered the cubs in an old blanket. They were severely underweight and cold to the touch. As she carried them up the cellar steps, the male bear backed away, allowing her to pass but keeping his eyes fixed on the precious bundle. "Don't worry," she told him softly. "I'll take care of them, just like I took care of you." Inside the cabin, Eleanor worked quickly to set up a warm, protected space for the cubs, using her knowledge from decades of wildlife rehabilitation. She prepared a mixture of warm water, honey, and a little salt, a crude but effective rehydration solution, and began carefully feeding the weakest cub with an eyedropper. "We need to get them to a proper wildlife facility," Wilson said, watching her work with obvious respect. "But you're doing exactly what they need right now." Through the window, Eleanor could see the bear had returned to his spot on the porch, but his posture had changed. The desperate vigilance was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like relief. As she tended to the cubs, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Somehow, against all scientific understanding of bear behavior, this male had not only protected orphaned cubs, but had sought out human help, her help specifically, when they became too weak to survive on his own. It defied everything she thought she knew about wild animals. And yet, here was the evidence, tiny and fragile in her hands. "How did the cubs get into your cellar?" Wilson asked, the question that had been troubling him since their discovery. Eleanor pointed to a small window near the ground level. "That window doesn't latch properly anymore. It swings open in strong wind sometimes. She looked down at the cubs, imagining the scenario. The mother must have pushed them through there looking for shelter. And then what happened to her? Wilson wondered aloud. Eleanor had been asking herself the same question. I don't know. But something must have happened, and this male, the one I rehabilitated, somehow found the cubs and has been protecting them. As the day wore on, more officials arrived, a veterinarian, additional wildlife officers, even Sheriff Jenkins himself. The story of Eleanor's bear had grown even more extraordinary, and no one quite knew what to make of it. The cubs were examined, given proper medical treatment, and deemed stable enough to remain in Eleanor's care overnight until arrangements could be made to transfer them to a specialized facility. Throughout it all, the male bear remained on the porch, occasionally pacing, but never leaving. As night fell and the officials finally departed with promises to return in the morning, Eleanor found herself alone with 4 bears, 3 tiny ones inside her cabin and 1 massive guardian outside her door. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since Frank died, since she'd retired from her rehabilitation work. For the first time in years, someone needed her, even if that someone was a family of bears. Morning came with a flurry of activity. Eleanor had spent the night alternating between caring for the cubs and checking on their protector through the window. By dawn, she was exhausted but filled with a sense of purpose that had been absent for years. Margaret arrived early, having heard the extraordinary news from Sheriff Jenkins. Her face registered shock when she saw the male bear still sitting sentinel on the porch and the 3 tiny cubs nestled in a makeshift den Eleanor had created from a large cardboard box lined with blankets near the fireplace. "Eleanor Mitchell," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Only you would turn your living room into a bear nursery?" Eleanor smiled wearily. "They needed help, Maggie. What was I supposed to do?" "The same thing any reasonable person would do. Call the authorities and stay safely inside." Margaret approached the box cautiously, her expression softening as she looked at the cubs. "They are adorable, though, I'll give you that." The cubs were doing better this morning. Eleanor had been feeding them a special formula the veterinarian had left, similar to what she'd used years ago in her rehabilitation work, and all 3 had taken it eagerly. The smallest one, which Eleanor had started calling Tiny, was still concerning her. It was noticeably weaker than its siblings, its breathing sometimes labored. "The wildlife officer, David Wilson, says they'll be back today with transport cages," Eleanor explained, carefully feeding Tiny with a small syringe adapted as a bottle. "They want to take the cubs to the Northern Rockies Wildlife Center in Kalispell." Margaret settled into a chair, watching her friend work. "And what about the big one outside? What's going to happen to him?" Eleanor's hands paused momentarily. "I don't know. Normally, they'd tranquilize and relocate him far from human habitation. But this situation isn't normal, is it? You really believe it's the same bear you rehabilitated all those years ago?" Margaret asked, her tone gentle but skeptical. "I know it sounds crazy." Eleanor carefully returned Tiny to the box with its siblings. "But that notch in his ear, it's distinctive. And the way he's been behaving, he sought me out specifically, Maggie. He remembered." Margaret didn't argue, but her expression revealed her doubts. "Even if it is the same bear, what do you think happens now? You can't keep a full-grown black bear as a pet." "Of course not," Eleanor replied, though the thought of seeing him tranquilized and carted away filled her with unexpected sadness. "But maybe there's a way to keep him nearby, to monitor him. He's clearly not a typical bear." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. David Wilson had returned, along with Dr. Yvonne Chen, the head veterinarian from the Wildlife Center. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Chen said as she entered, her eyes immediately going to the box of cubs. "How are our little patients doing?" While Dr. Chen examined the cubs, Wilson updated Eleanor on the situation. "We've got transport ready, but there's a complication." He lowered his voice. "Robert Hoffman has filed a formal complaint with the county. He's demanding the male bear be destroyed, claiming it poses an imminent threat to public safety." Eleanor felt a surge of anger. "That's ridiculous. This bear has shown no aggression whatsoever." "I agree," Wilson said. "But Hoffman has influence in the community, and he's stirring up fear. There's going to be a special town meeting tonight to discuss the situation." "The bear stays here until then," Eleanor said firmly. "I won't let them kill him based on fear and ignorance." Wilson hesitated, then nodded. "I can delay any action until after the meeting, but Ms. Mitchell, you should know, this isn't just about one bear." The presence of a male bear caring for cubs challenges everything we understand about bear behavior. Some of my colleagues are already suggesting the animal must be sick or brain damaged to act this way. Or, Eleanor countered, maybe we don't understand bears as well as we think we do. Dr. Chen joined the conversation, her expression serious. "The cubs are stable, but the smallest one concerns me. It's showing signs of respiratory distress. I'd like to take them to our facility today, where we have better equipment." Eleanor felt torn. She had grown attached to the cubs overnight, but she knew the Wildlife Center could provide better care. "What about their guardian? Can he come too?" Dr. Chen exchanged glances with Wilson. "That would be highly unusual. Our facility isn't equipped to handle adult bears, especially not one with such atypical behavior." "He protected these cubs," Eleanor insisted. "Doesn't that count for something?" "It's unprecedented, Doctor," Chen admitted. "Male bears typically have no interest in cubs. In fact, they're often a threat to them. We need to study this behavior, understand it." As they discussed options, Eleanor noticed the male bear had moved closer to the window, as if listening to their conversation. His intelligent eyes followed their movements, and when Dr. Chen approached the box of cubs, he pressed his nose against the glass, fogging it with his breath. "Look at him," Eleanor said softly. "He's worried about them." Wilson observed the bear's behavior with fascination. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of wildlife management." Eventually, they reached a compromise. The cubs would be transported to the Wildlife Center for proper care, but no action would be taken regarding the male bear until after the town meeting. Eleanor insisted on accompanying the cubs to the center, worried especially about Tiny's condition. "The bear might follow the transport vehicle," Wilson warned. "We've seen cases where relocated bears travel remarkable distances to return to familiar territory." "Let him," Eleanor said. "Maybe that's exactly what should happen." As they prepared the cubs for transport, Eleanor approached the window where the bear was watching. "I'm taking them to get help," she said softly, knowing he couldn't understand her words but hoping somehow to communicate her intentions. "They'll be safe, I promise." To everyone's surprise, when they carried the container with the cubs to the Wildlife Service truck, the bear made no move to interfere. He watched from the porch, his posture alert but not threatening. "It's almost like he understands," Margaret whispered, standing beside Eleanor as the cubs were loaded. "Maybe he does," Eleanor replied. Then, making a sudden decision, she approached Wilson. "I want to name them," she said. "The cubs." Wilson smiled. "That's not standard protocol, but given the circumstances, I don't see why not." Eleanor pointed to each cub in turn. "Hope, Faith, and Tiny," she said, "because that's what they've given me. Hope and faith that there's still purpose in my life, and Tiny because, well, he's the little fighter." As Eleanor climbed into the Wildlife Service truck to accompany the cubs to the center, she looked back at her cabin. The bear was still there, a dark sentinel against the snow. For a moment their eyes met across the distance, and Eleanor felt something pass between them. An understanding, a connection that defied explanation. "I'll be back," she whispered, "and I'll fight for you. I promise." The drive to the Northern Rockies Wildlife Center took nearly an hour, winding down from Eleanor's mountain property through forests blanketed in snow. Eleanor sat in the back of the vehicle with the cubs, monitoring them carefully, especially Tiny, whose breathing seemed to be growing more labored. At the center, a flurry of activity greeted their arrival. The cubs were whisked into a specialized care unit, with Eleanor following close behind, unwilling to let them out of her sight. The facility was impressive, far more advanced than the modest rehabilitation setup she'd had on her property years ago. Dr. Chen worked quickly, placing Tiny in an oxygen-enriched environment and starting intravenous fluids for all three cubs. "They're severely malnourished," she explained to Eleanor. "It's remarkable they've survived this long without their mother." "Thanks to their guardian," Eleanor reminded her. "Yes," Dr. Chen agreed thoughtfully. "That's the puzzle we're all trying to solve." As the day progressed, Eleanor found herself drawn into the cubs' care, her decades of experience with wildlife rehabilitation making her a valuable assistant to the center's staff. She felt rejuvenated, useful in a way she hadn't since retiring. When Dr. Chen suggested she might want to go home and rest, Eleanor firmly declined. "I promised him I'd look after them," she said simply. By late afternoon, Hope and Faith were showing significant improvement, eagerly taking formula and becoming more active. Tiny, however, continued to struggle. His breathing remained labored, and despite the oxygen and medication, his condition seemed to be deteriorating. "We're doing everything we can," Dr. Chen assured Eleanor, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But you should prepare yourself. The smallest ones sometimes don't make it, even with the best care." Eleanor nodded, blinking back tears. She had lost animals in her care before. It was an inevitable part of rehabilitation work. But this felt different. These cubs represented something more than just wildlife in need. They were a connection to her past, to the work that had given her life meaning, and to the extraordinary bear who had sought her out after all these years. As evening approached, Wilson returned to the center, his expression grim. "The town meeting is set for 7 o'clock at the community hall," he told Eleanor. "Hoffman has gathered quite a following. There's talk of forming a hunting party if Wildlife Services doesn't handle the problem." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, a fierce determination replacing her weariness. "Then I need to be there. I need to make them understand." "I'll drive you," Wilson offered. "But Ms. Mitchell, Eleanor, you should know that public opinion is running against us on this." "People are scared, and fear makes it hard for them to listen to reason." "Then I'll make them listen," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "Because I won't let them kill that bear for the crime of caring too much." The Whitefish Community Hall was packed to capacity when Eleanor arrived with David Wilson. News of the bear situation had spread throughout the small mountain town, drawing curious onlookers along with concerned citizens. Eleanor felt all eyes turn to her as she entered, the eccentric widow who lived alone in the mountains and was now defending a wild predator. Sheriff Jenkins met them at the door, his weathered face creased with worry. "It's a full house tonight, Ellie," he warned in a low voice, "and Hoffman's got people riled up pretty good." Eleanor nodded, scanning the crowd. She spotted Margaret in the third row, who waved and patted the empty seat beside her. As Eleanor made her way forward, she could hear the whispers following her. "That's her, the bear lady. My cousin says she talks to it like it's a person. Probably lost her marbles after her husband died." Eleanor held her head high, refusing to be intimidated. At 72, she had long since outgrown the need for public approval. What mattered now was saving an extraordinary animal from humanity's fear and ignorance. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order, explaining the purpose and introducing the key players: Sheriff Jenkins, Wildlife Officer Wilson, and Dr. Chen, who had arrived just minutes before Eleanor. The veterinarian had left her staff caring for the cubs, including Tiny, whose condition remained critical. "Before we open the floor for discussion," Mayor Thompson said, "I'd like to invite Robert Hoffman to present his concerns as he requested this meeting." Hoffman rose from his seat in the front row, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 60s with a meticulously trimmed beard and cold blue eyes. He wore a flannel shirt and hunting jacket, the unofficial uniform of the local guides. "Thank you, Mayor," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. "Most of you know me. My family has lived in this valley for 4 generations. I've guided hunts through these mountains for 30 years, and I know bear behavior better than most." Eleanor resisted the urge to scoff audibly. Killing animals didn't make one an expert on them. "What we're dealing with here is a dangerous anomaly," Hoffman continued. "A male bear that's not hibernating in winter, that's taken up residence at a human dwelling, and that's showing completely unnatural behavior. The textbook definition of a problem bear." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Now, I respect Eleanor Mitchell. Her late husband, Frank, was a good man, and she's done fine work with wildlife over the years. Hoffman turned to look directly at Eleanor, his expression a mixture of pity and condescension. "But her emotional attachment to this animal is clouding her judgment. The bear needs to be destroyed before someone gets hurt or killed." The word "destroyed" sent a chill through Eleanor. It was the clinical term wildlife managers used when they couldn't bring themselves to say "killed." David Wilson was next to speak, presenting a more measured assessment. He explained the unusual circumstances, the orphaned cubs, the male bear's protective behavior, and Eleanor's history with bear rehabilitation. "While I understand the concerns," Wilson concluded, "this bear has shown no aggression toward humans. In fact, it's demonstrated remarkable restraint and what appears to be problem-solving intelligence. From a scientific perspective, this is an unprecedented opportunity to study complex bear behavior." Dr. Chen followed, providing a clinical update on the cub's condition and explaining the scientific significance of a male bear caring for orphaned cubs that weren't his own. "In my 20 years of veterinary practice specializing in wildlife, I've never encountered or read about such behavior," she said. "It challenges our fundamental understanding of bear social structures." Finally, it was Eleanor's turn to speak. As she rose from her seat, she felt a momentary flutter of anxiety. Public speaking had never been her forte. That had been Frank's domain. But as she walked to the front of the room, she drew strength from the conviction that she was this bear's only advocate. "Many of you have known me for decades," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "You know I'm not some foolish old woman who doesn't understand the dangers of wildlife. I've spent my life working with injured animals, including predators." She paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with familiar faces. 7 years ago, I rehabilitated a bear cub with a distinctive notch in its right ear, just like the bear currently at my property. That can't be coincidence. Somehow this bear remembered me, remembered that I helped him once. And when he found orphaned cubs in need, he came to the one human he associated with safety and care. A skeptical murmur went through the crowd, but Eleanor pressed on. "I know how it sounds, but consider the facts. This bear has had multiple opportunities to attack me or others, yet has shown no aggression. He's been protecting those cubs, not threatening humans. If we kill him for that, what does that say about us?" Hoffman stood again, not waiting to be recognized. "With all due respect, Eleanor, you're anthropomorphizing a wild animal. Bears don't remember humans that way. They don't seek help or protect cubs that aren't their own. This is abnormal behavior, which makes the animal unpredictable and dangerous." "Maybe," Eleanor countered, "we don't know as much about bears as we think we do. Maybe this bear is showing us there's more to these animals than our textbooks can explain." The debate continued, growing heated at times. Community members voiced concerns about safety, particularly for children and pets. Others suggested relocating both the adult bear and cubs to a more remote area. Through it all, Eleanor stood her ground, advocating passionately for the bear she had come to call Shadow, a name she'd given him in her mind but hadn't spoken aloud until tonight. As the discussion was reaching its peak, Dr. Chen's phone rang. She stepped outside to take the call, returning moments later with a grave expression. She whispered something to Wilson, who nodded and approached the microphone. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but we've just received word that the smallest cub, the one Eleanor has been calling Tiny, is in critical condition. The veterinary team is doing everything they can, but—" He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening. "They're asking if you want to be there." Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her. She had known Tiny was struggling, but some part of her had believed the cub would pull through with proper care. Without a word, she gathered her coat and headed for the door. "This meeting isn't finished," Hoffman protested. "We haven't reached a decision about the adult bear." Eleanor paused at the doorway, turning back to face the room. "That bear brought those cubs to me because he trusted me to help them. I won't let Tiny die alone while we sit here arguing." To her surprise, Dr. Chen stepped forward. "I'll drive you to the center right away, Eleanor." Then, addressing the crowd, "As the veterinarian in charge of these animals, I'm formally requesting that no action be taken regarding the adult bear until we've had more time to study this unique situation. This could be a significant scientific discovery about bear behavior." Mayor Thompson nodded. "I think that's reasonable. We'll reconvene in 1 week to reassess. In the meantime, Sheriff Jenkins will maintain increased patrols in the area, and Officer Wilson will monitor the bear's behavior." Hoffman's face darkened with anger, but he said nothing as Eleanor and Dr. Chen hurried out into the cold night. The drive to the Wildlife Center was tense and silent. Eleanor stared out the window at the moonlit snow, thinking about the tiny cub fighting for its life and the faithful guardian still waiting on her porch. There was a connection there that defied scientific explanation, a bond that crossed species boundaries and challenged everything humans thought they knew about wild animals. When they arrived at the center, Eleanor rushed to the intensive care unit where Tiny was being treated. The small cub lay in an incubator, hooked to monitors that beeped with alarming irregularity. His breathing was shallow and labored, his tiny chest rising and falling with visible effort. "We've done everything medically possible," the attending veterinarian explained gently. "Sometimes, especially with cubs born in winter when resources are scarce, they simply aren't strong enough to survive." Eleanor pulled a chair close to the incubator and sat down, placing her hand against the clear plastic. "May I touch him?" she asked. The vet hesitated, then nodded. "It won't hurt him at this point." Carefully, the incubator was opened, and Eleanor placed her weathered hand next to Tiny's small form. The cub, sensing her presence, moved slightly toward her warmth. With her index finger, Eleanor gently stroked his head, feeling the soft fur and the fragile skull beneath. "You fought so hard, little one," she whispered. "It's okay to rest now." As if he had been waiting for permission, Tiny took one final, shuddering breath and was still. The monitor flatlined, its harsh tone filling the quiet room until someone mercifully silenced it. Eleanor felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but made no move to wipe them away. She continued to stroke the cub's fur, now growing cold beneath her fingers. "I'm sorry," Dr. Chen said softly from behind her. "You did everything you could." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. She had lost animals before. It was an inevitable part of rehabilitation work. But this loss felt heavier, more significant somehow. It wasn't just about one small bear cub. It was about a promise she had made to Shadow, a trust she had failed to honor. "What about the others?" she finally managed to ask. "Hope and faith?" "They're doing well," Dr. Chen assured her. "They're stronger and responding to treatment. Their prognosis is good. Eleanor took comfort in that, at least. 2 would survive. 2 would grow up, hopefully to be released back into the wild someday. "I need to tell him," Eleanor said suddenly, rising from her chair. "Shadow needs to know." Dr. Chen and Wilson exchanged concerned glances. "Eleanor," Wilson said gently, "bears don't understand death the way we do. They don't mourn like humans." "This bear isn't like other bears," Eleanor insisted. "You've seen that yourself. He trusted me with those cubs, and one of them has died in my care. I owe him the truth." After some discussion, it was agreed that Wilson would drive Eleanor back to her cabin that night, though both he and Dr. Chen expressed concerns about her facing the bear alone, especially after receiving such emotional news. "I'll stay in the car until you're safely inside," Wilson promised, as they drove through the darkness back toward Eleanor's mountain home. "And I'll come check on you first thing in the morning." Eleanor barely heard him. Her mind was on the conversation she needed to have with a bear. A conversation about loss, about failure, and about the 2 cubs that still had a fighting chance. It sounded absurd even to her own ears, but in her heart she knew it was necessary. As Wilson's headlights illuminated her cabin, Eleanor saw that Shadow was still there, still maintaining his vigil on her porch. The sight of him, patient, faithful, driven by an instinct or intelligence no human fully understood, brought fresh tears to her eyes. How would she tell him that Tiny was gone? And would he somehow impossibly understand? Eleanor took a deep breath as Wilson's car pulled away, leaving her alone with Shadow. The bear had risen to his feet when they arrived, his dark eyes following their movements with that unnerving intelligence she had come to recognize. Now, as she approached the porch steps, he watched her expectantly, perhaps sensing that something had changed. "I have to tell you something," Eleanor said softly, her voice breaking. She sank down onto the top step, ignoring the cold that immediately seeped through her clothing. Shadow remained a respectful distance away, his breath visible in the frigid night air. "Tiny didn't make it." The words hung between them, crystallizing in the moonlight. Eleanor felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she continued. "I tried. We all tried. He was just too small, too weak." She pulled her coat tighter around herself, more for comfort than warmth. "The others are doing well, though. Hope and faith. They're fighters, like you." Shadow tilted his massive head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, in a movement so deliberate it took Eleanor's breath away, he lowered himself to the porch floor, resting his head on his paws with a deep, rumbling sigh that seemed to emanate from his very soul. "You understand, don't you?" Eleanor whispered. "Somehow, you understand." They sat like that for what felt like hours, an elderly woman and a wild bear sharing a grief that transcended species. The night was bitterly cold, the temperature well below freezing, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to move. There was something sacred in this moment, something that might never come again. Finally, when her limbs were stiff and her tears had dried, Eleanor stood. "I should go inside," she said, "and you should find shelter, too." "It's too cold to stay out here." To her surprise, Shadow rose and moved toward the side of the cabin, the same path he had taken when leading her to the storm cellar and the cubs. This time, however, he continued around to the back, where a small lean-to sheltered Eleanor's woodpile. The bear settled himself beneath it, protected from the wind and snow but still within sight of the cabin. "Good night," Eleanor said, her voice carrying in the still mountain air. "I'll see you in the morning." Inside, Eleanor built up the fire and made herself a cup of strong tea, adding a splash of whiskey from the bottle Frank had always kept for medicinal purposes. As she settled into her armchair, the emotional weight of the day crashed over her like a wave. Tiny's death, the town meeting, the battle that still lay ahead with Hoffman and his supporters, it was almost too much to bear. "What am I doing, Frank?" she asked aloud, looking at the photograph of her late husband that sat on the mantelpiece. "Taking on the whole town for a bear? They all think I've lost my mind." She could almost hear Frank's response. "Since when have you cared what anyone thinks, Ellie?" With that thought warming her more than the tea or fire, Eleanor drifted into an exhausted sleep in her chair. She awoke with a start some time later, disoriented and stiff. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was growing cold. But it wasn't the chill that had awakened her. It was a sound. A vehicle, engine running, somewhere near her property. Eleanor moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon had set, leaving only the stars to illuminate the night. At first she saw nothing. Then a flash of light caught her eye, a flashlight beam moving along the tree line at the edge of her clearing. Her first thought was that Wilson had returned to check on her, but he would have come to the front door, not skulked around the perimeter of her property. A knot of fear formed in her stomach as she realized someone was trespassing on her land in the middle of the night. Eleanor reached for the phone to call Sheriff Jenkins, but the line was dead. Whether from the cold or something more sinister, she couldn't tell. Her cell phone, rarely used and often forgotten, was charging in the kitchen. As she moved to retrieve it, she heard voices outside, hushed but angry, multiple people. "Just trank it and be done," someone was saying. "We can drag it into the forest and finish it there. No one needs to know." "The old woman might hear," another voice responded. "She's probably watching for it." Eleanor's blood ran cold. They were talking about Shadow. They had come to kill him under cover of darkness, away from the eyes of the law and the protection Wilson had arranged. Without stopping to think, Eleanor grabbed Frank's old hunting jacket and a flashlight and stepped out onto her back porch. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice stronger than she felt. "This is private property. Sheriff Jenkins is on his way." The lie was transparent. With the phone lines down, she had no way to call the sheriff. But it was all she could think of. There was a moment of silence. Then the sound of hurried movement. Flashlight beams swung wildly, then pointed directly at her, momentarily blinding her. "Go back inside, Mrs. Mitchell," a familiar voice called out. "This doesn't concern you." Robert Hoffman. Eleanor felt a surge of anger cutting through her fear. "Like hell it doesn't, Robert. You're on my land planning to kill an animal under state protection." "That bear is a menace," Hoffman replied, stepping forward into the light. Behind him, Eleanor could make out two other men, both carrying rifles. "The town meeting was a waste of time." "Some things need to be handled by those who understand the situation." "The only menace here is you," Eleanor retorted, her heart racing. "Shadow hasn't hurt anyone. He's protected those cubs when he had no reason to. He's shown more humanity than you're showing right now." Hoffman's face hardened. "Shadow. You've named it now. This isn't one of your rehabilitation projects, Eleanor. It's a wild predator that's acting abnormally. That makes it dangerous." "The only danger here is from men with guns in the middle of the night," Eleanor said, standing her ground despite the fear coursing through her. "Leave now or I'll press charges for trespassing and illegal hunting." One of the men with Hoffman stepped forward, his face shadowed beneath a heavy winter hat. "Let's just go, Rob. This isn't worth jail time." "No one's going to jail," Hoffman snapped. "We're protecting the community. That bear could attack anyone, a child, a hiker." "Are you willing to have that on your conscience, Eleanor?" As they argued, Eleanor became aware of movement in her peripheral vision. Shadow had emerged from his shelter under the woodpile and was now standing at the edge of the light, his massive form a darker shadow against the night. His eyes reflected the flashlight beams, two burning points in the darkness. "Robert," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a warning tone. "Don't move." Hoffman misinterpreted her caution. "I'm not afraid of you, Eleanor. I'm doing what needs to be done." "It's not me you should be afraid of," Eleanor replied, nodding toward Shadow. When Hoffman turned and saw the bear standing less than 20 feet away, he swore and raised his rifle in one fluid motion. "Get back!" he shouted to his companions. "I've got this!" "No!" Eleanor screamed, lunging forward without thinking. She collided with Hoffman just as he fired, the impact throwing off his aim. The shot went wide, the sound like thunder in the quiet night. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Shadow, startled by the gunshot, reared up on his hind legs, towering over them all. Hoffman shoved Eleanor aside roughly, sending her sprawling onto the frozen ground. As she fell, her head struck a protruding rock, and pain exploded behind her eyes. Through a haze of pain and gathering darkness, Eleanor saw Hoffman take aim again. With the last of her strength, she called out, "Shadow, run!" Then everything went black. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of confused sounds around her, shouting, another gunshot, a deep roaring that seemed to make the very ground tremble. She tried to open her eyes, to call out again, but her body wouldn't respond. The cold seeped into her, and she felt herself slipping deeper into darkness. A strange warmth pressed against her side, pulling her back toward consciousness. With immense effort, Eleanor forced her eyes open. The world swam into focus slowly, the stars overhead spinning in dizzying circles. She was lying on her back in the snow, and something large and warm was pressed against her. Shadow. The bear had positioned himself beside her, his massive body blocking the wind, providing warmth against the deadly cold. One of his paws was bloodied, and there was a tear in his fur where a bullet had grazed his shoulder. But he was alive, and he was protecting her as surely as he had protected the orphaned cubs. "Shadow," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. The bear turned his head toward her, those intelligent eyes finding hers in the darkness. "You should have run." Somewhere in the distance, Eleanor heard the wail of sirens. Someone must have heard the gunshots and called for help. She tried to sit up, but her head throbbed sickeningly, and she fell back. Shadow made a soft huffing sound, as if telling her to stay still. "They'll kill you if they find you here," Eleanor murmured, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his fur. "You have to go." But Shadow didn't move. He remained beside her, a guardian against the cold and darkness, until the flashing lights of sheriff's vehicles illuminated the clearing and voices called her name. As consciousness slipped away from her again, Eleanor's last thought was of Shadow's unwavering loyalty. A wild creature choosing to protect a human who had once helped him, even at the risk of his own life. In that moment, she understood something profound about the connections that bind all living things, something beyond scientific explanation or human comprehension. Then the darkness claimed her completely, and she knew no more. Eleanor woke to the steady beeping of hospital monitors and the antiseptic smell that always seemed to permeate medical facilities. For a moment, she couldn't remember how she had gotten there or why her head throbbed with such intensity. Then it all came rushing back. Hoffman with his rifle, the gunshot falling and hitting her head, and Shadow protecting her in the snow. She tried to sit up too quickly, sending a wave of dizziness washing over her. "Whoa there, take it easy," a familiar voice said. Margaret was sitting beside the bed, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd been there for some time. "You've got a concussion and mild hypothermia. Doctor says you're lucky to be alive." "Shadow," Eleanor croaked, her voice rough from disuse. "The bear. What happened to him?" Margaret exchanged glances with Sheriff Jenkins, who Eleanor now noticed was standing near the door. The sheriff stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "That's quite a bear you've befriended, Ellie," he said. "When we arrived, it was lying next to you, keeping you warm. Wouldn't let any of us near you at first. David Wilson had to talk to it like it was a person before it would back off enough for the paramedics to reach you." Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes. "Is he okay? Hoffman shot at him." "The bear was wounded, but not seriously," Sheriff Jenkins assured her. "Wilson managed to tranquilize it humanely after we got you into the ambulance. It's being treated at the Wildlife Center right now." "And Hoffman?" Eleanor asked, her voice hardening. The sheriff's expression darkened. "Robert Hoffman and his friends are facing multiple charges: trespassing, illegal hunting, reckless endangerment, and assault in your case. One of his companions turned on him pretty quickly when we started asking questions. Seems Hoffman had been obsessed with killing that bear since it first appeared on your property. He said it was dangerous," Eleanor remembered. "Well, that's where things get interesting," Sheriff Jenkins said, pulling up a chair. "After we got you to the hospital, I had a long talk with Wilson about this whole situation. He suggested we check if there were any previous incidents involving Hoffman and bears. Turns out 3 years ago, Hoffman's son James was killed in a bear attack while hunting illegally in a restricted area during denning season." Eleanor's breath caught. "He was seeking revenge." "Appears so. But here's the kicker. The bear that killed James Hoffman was a female with cubs, a female with a distinctive white chest marking according to the autopsy report." Margaret leaned forward. "Like the mother of the cubs Shadow was protecting?" Sheriff Jenkins nodded. "Wilson thinks so. The timing fits. The location fits. Hoffman's son disturbed a denning mother with newborn cubs, and she attacked him. Standard bear behavior, protecting her young." "And Hoffman killed her in revenge," Eleanor whispered, the pieces falling into place. "Leaving the cubs orphaned." "That's what Wilson suspects, though we may never prove it. But it explains why Hoffman was so determined to kill your bear. In his mind, it was connected to his son's death." Eleanor closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the tragic circle of events. A young man's reckless actions, a mother bear's protective instinct, a father's grief turned to vengeance, and somehow, in the middle of it all, a male bear with a capacity for care that defied scientific understanding. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "That's partly up to you," Sheriff Jenkins said. "You were right about the bear, Shadow, as you call him. When our deputies arrived, they all saw the same thing. That bear wasn't threatening you. It was protecting you. Even with a bullet wound, it stayed by your side, keeping you warm until help arrived." Eleanor's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and worry. "But will they still try to relocate him? Or worse?" "That's where things get complicated," Margaret said, reaching for Eleanor's hand. "Your bear has become something of a celebrity, Ellie. Someone recorded the whole thing on their phone, Shadow guarding you, the paramedics approaching cautiously, Wilson talking him down. It's all over social media and the local news. People are calling him the Guardian Bear." Eleanor stared at her friend in disbelief. "You're joking." "I wish I was," Margaret replied with a small smile. "My phone's been ringing off the hook with reporters wanting to talk to your best friend, meaning me, not the bear. The point is," Sheriff Jenkins continued, "public opinion has shifted dramatically. The state wildlife department is facing pressure to study Shadow rather than relocate him. Dr. Chen has already started the paperwork to classify him as a research subject rather than a problem animal." Relief washed over Eleanor like a warm wave. "And the cubs? Hope and Faith?" "Doing well," Margaret assured her. "Dr. Chen says they're responding to treatment and gaining weight. They've been moved to the center's nursery area." Eleanor nodded, letting her eyes drift closed again as exhaustion overtook her. Before she surrendered to sleep, she had one more question. "When can I go home?" "The doctor wants to keep you for observation at least another day," Margaret said. "That was quite a blow to the head you took. not to mention lying in the snow for who knows how long before the sheriff found you." "Shadow found me first," Eleanor murmured, already drifting off. "He's always finding me when I need him." When Eleanor was finally released from the hospital 3 days later, she was surprised to find David Wilson waiting to drive her home. The wildlife officer seemed different somehow, more deferential, less skeptical. "I wanted to update you personally," he explained as they drove through the snowy landscape toward her cabin. "The situation has changed considerably since the night you were injured." Eleanor listened as Wilson detailed the developments. The State Wildlife Department, in cooperation with Montana State University, had established a research project centered on Shadow and the orphaned cubs. They wanted to study the unusual bond between the male bear and the cubs, as well as the apparent recognition and trust the bear had shown toward Eleanor. "It's unprecedented," Wilson admitted. "Male bears simply don't behave this way. But the evidence is right in front of us, so we have to reconsider what we thought we knew." "What does this mean for Shadow?" Eleanor asked. "And for the cubs?" "That's why I wanted to talk to you directly," Wilson said, glancing over at her. "We're proposing to establish a small research station on a portion of your property, with your permission, of course. It would allow us to monitor Shadow while keeping him in familiar territory. The cubs would remain at the rehabilitation center until they're stronger, but eventually could be returned to a controlled release area near your cabin." Eleanor was stunned. "You want to use my land as a bear sanctuary?" "Something like that," Wilson nodded. "We'd provide compensation, of course, and build proper facilities for observation. It would be a unique opportunity to study bear behavior in a controlled but natural setting. And Shadow wouldn't be relocated or—" Eleanor couldn't bring herself to say the word destroyed. "No," Wilson assured her. "In fact, he'd be protected. This research could revolutionize our understanding of bear cognition and social behavior." As they pulled up to her cabin, Eleanor saw that someone had cleared the snow from her driveway and porch. Margaret's doing, no doubt, but something was missing. "Where is he?" Eleanor asked, scanning the area for Shadow's familiar form. "At the Wildlife Center, recovering from his injuries," Wilson explained. "The bullet grazed his shoulder, painful but not life-threatening. Dr. Chen wanted to keep him under observation for a few days. Make sure there's no infection." Eleanor nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. After everything they'd been through, it felt wrong somehow to return home without Shadow keeping watch from her porch. "When can he come back?" she asked as Wilson helped her up the steps. "That's something we need to discuss," Wilson said carefully. "Legally, we can't just return a wild bear to someone's property. But given the unique circumstances, and with the research project in place, we could arrange a controlled release in this area once he's fully recovered." Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming. Margaret had clearly been there recently. Fresh flowers sat on the table, and the refrigerator was stocked with easy-to-prepare meals. But the space felt emptier than Eleanor had ever known it, even in the lonely years after Frank's death. Over the next few days, Eleanor settled back into her routine, though her thoughts were constantly with Shadow and the cubs. Dr. Chen called daily with updates on their condition. Hope and faith were thriving, growing stronger and more active each day. Shadow's wound was healing well, but the bear seemed restless in captivity, pacing his enclosure and watching the doors whenever anyone entered. "He's looking for you," Dr. Chen suggested during one call. "Would you consider visiting? It might calm him down." Eleanor agreed immediately, and Margaret drove her to the Wildlife Center the following day. As they approached Shadow's enclosure, a large outdoor space designed to mimic a natural habitat, Eleanor felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. Would he remember her? Would he understand that she hadn't abandoned him? Dr. Chen led her to a viewing area, where they could see into the enclosure without disturbing the bear. Shadow was lying on a rock platform, seemingly disinterested in his surroundings. But the moment Eleanor spoke his name, his head snapped up, ears forward, eyes searching until they found her. "He recognizes your voice," Dr. Chen said, unable to keep the wonder from her tone. Eleanor moved closer to the barrier, placing her hand against the protective glass. Shadow approached cautiously, his massive head tilted in that now familiar expression of curiosity. When he reached the glass, he pressed his nose against it, directly opposite Eleanor's hand. "Hello, old friend," Eleanor whispered, tears blurring her vision. "I've missed you." Shadow made a soft huffing sound, his breath fogging the glass between them. For several minutes they remained like that, connected yet separated, each recognizing in the other something that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Chen murmured, watching them. "It's like he knows exactly who you are." "He does," Eleanor said simply. "We've saved each other now." Before they left, Dr. Chen took Eleanor to see the cubs as well. Hope and Faith had nearly doubled in size since she'd last seen them, their fur glossy and eyes bright with health. They tumbled over each other playfully in their enclosure, showing none of the trauma they had endured. "They're going to be fine," Dr. Chen assured her. "In a year or so they'll be ready for release back into the wild." "Near my property?" Eleanor asked hopefully. "That's the plan," Dr. Chen confirmed. "With the research station established, we'll be able to monitor them while still giving them freedom to live as wild bears should." As they drove back to her cabin, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. There was purpose in her life again, not just the daily tasks of survival, but something meaningful, something that would outlast her. "You know," Margaret said as they turned onto the mountain road that led to Eleanor's property, "when Frank died, I worried you'd fade away up here all alone. Instead, you've started a revolution in bear research and conservation. Only you, Ellie, only you could make friends with a wild bear and end up changing the world." Eleanor smiled, watching the snow-covered pines pass by outside the window. "Not the world, Maggie. Just one small corner of it. Sometimes that's enough." Spring arrived in the Montana mountains with its usual dramatic flourish. Brilliant wildflowers pushing through melting snow, newly awakened wildlife venturing from winter shelters, and the forest filling with birdsong after months of silence. For Eleanor, this spring marked the beginning of a new chapter in a life she had once thought was nearing its conclusion. The research station on her property had been completed in late March, a modest structure that blended with the surrounding forest, equipped with cameras and monitoring equipment but designed to minimize human impact on the wildlife. Dr. Chen had overseen the project personally, ensuring that every detail met both scientific requirements and Eleanor's wishes for her land. Shadow had been released back onto Eleanor's property in early April, once his shoulder had fully healed and the weather had warmed enough for comfortable transition. The reunion had been nothing short of magical. Eleanor had waited on her porch as Wilson and his team opened the transport cage at the edge of the clearing. Shadow had emerged cautiously, sniffing the air and scanning his surroundings until his eyes found Eleanor. Then, with deliberate dignity, he had walked directly to her porch and settled in his familiar spot, as if returning from a brief outing rather than weeks of captivity. "I've never seen anything like it," Wilson had whispered to Dr. Chen, both watching from a respectful distance. "It's like he's coming home." Now, on a mild May morning, Eleanor sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching Shadow forage at the edge of the forest. The bear had established a routine over the past month, patrolling the perimeter of her property in the early morning, then spending the day alternating between foraging and resting within sight of the cabin. He never approached too closely when others were present, maintaining a respectful distance that kept both humans and himself comfortable. But when Eleanor was alone, he would often come to the porch, sometimes sitting beside her in companionable silence as she read or worked on small projects. The sound of tires on her gravel driveway announced Margaret's arrival. Shadow's head lifted at the noise, but he showed no alarm. He had grown accustomed to Margaret's regular visits, recognizing her car and voice as unthreatening. "Morning, Bear Whisperer," Margaret called cheerfully as she climbed out of her SUV carrying a bakery box. "I brought those cinnamon rolls you like from Maggie's Cafe." Eleanor smiled at her friend. "You're spoiling me." "Someone has to," Margaret replied, settling into the chair beside Eleanor and opening the box. "You're too busy mothering those bears to take care of yourself." It was true that Eleanor had thrown herself wholeheartedly into the research project. She kept detailed journals of Shadow's behavior, worked closely with the university students who monitored the cameras and collected data, and visited Hope and Faith at the Wildlife Center twice a week. The cubs had continued to thrive, growing rapidly and developing the skills they would need for eventual release. "Dr. Chen called this morning," Eleanor said, accepting a cinnamon roll. "They're planning to move Hope and Faith to the pre-release enclosure next week. It's the final step before bringing them here." The pre-release enclosure was a large natural habitat area at the Wildlife Center where rehabilitated animals spent their final weeks before returning to the wild. It minimized human contact and allowed the animals to develop more independent behaviors. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked. "About how Shadow will react to them?" Eleanor glanced toward the bear, who was now digging for grubs beneath a fallen log. "A little, but Dr. Chen thinks the connection is strong enough and will introduce them gradually with plenty of supervision." The plan they had developed was cautious but hopeful. The cubs would be released into a specially constructed enclosure on Eleanor's property, allowing Shadow to see and smell them without direct contact initially. If all went well, they would eventually allow supervised interaction, with the hope that the unusual bond would re-establish. "Have you heard anything about Hoffman?" Margaret asked, changing the subject. Eleanor's expression darkened slightly. "His attorney is still trying to get the charges reduced. Claims Robert was suffering from PTSD after his son's death and wasn't in his right mind." Robert Hoffman's case had become something of a local controversy. Some in the community, particularly those who made their living from hunting, sympathized with a father who had lost his son to a bear attack. Others were appalled by his vigilante actions and the assault on Eleanor. The case had opened difficult conversations about conservation, hunting ethics, and the coexistence of humans and wildlife in the changing Montana landscape. "Whatever happens with the legal system," Eleanor continued, "I hope he gets the help he needs. Grief can make people do terrible things, but it doesn't have to define them forever." Margaret shook her head in admiration. "Your capacity for forgiveness never ceases to amaze me. If someone had tried to kill my furry friend and nearly killed me in the process, I'm not sure I'd be so understanding." Eleanor smiled sadly. "I've had my share of anger, but what good would it do? Shadow has moved on. He doesn't hold grudges or seek revenge." "Maybe there's wisdom in that." As if hearing his name, Shadow looked up from his foraging and gazed toward the porch. Then, with unhurried grace, he began making his way toward them. Margaret tensed slightly. Even after months of witnessing the bear's gentle behavior around Eleanor, she hadn't quite adjusted to his proximity. "Should I go inside?" "No need," Eleanor assured her. "He's just curious about the smell of cinnamon rolls." Shadow approached the porch steps and sat, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly interested in their breakfast. His nose twitched as he caught the sweet scent. "Don't even think about it," Eleanor told him firmly. "These aren't for bears." Shadow huffed softly, as if expressing disappointment, then settled onto his stomach, content to watch them eat. "It's uncanny," Margaret murmured, "the way he seems to understand you." Eleanor nodded. "Doctor?" "Chen says he's challenging everything we thought we knew about bear intelligence and social behavior. The paper she's writing is apparently causing quite a stir in wildlife biology circles. The preliminary findings of the research project had indeed generated significant interest in the scientific community. Shadow's behavior, his recognition of Eleanor, his protection of orphaned cubs, his apparent understanding of human cues suggested cognitive and emotional capacities far beyond what had previously been attributed to bears. Some researchers remained skeptical, suggesting that Eleanor was anthropomorphizing normal animal behavior, but the video evidence and multiple witness accounts were difficult to dismiss. After breakfast, Margaret helped Eleanor prepare for the arrival of Hope and Faith. The pre-release enclosure on Eleanor's property, a half-acre area enclosed with special fencing, needed final inspections and adjustments. As they worked, Shadow watched from a distance, seemingly aware that something significant was happening. "Do you think he knows they're coming back?" Margaret asked as they stocked the small food cache that would supplement the cubs' natural foraging. Eleanor considered the question. "I don't know. But he's smart enough to sense that something's changing. He's been more attentive lately, watching the activity around the enclosure." By early afternoon, they had completed the preparations, and Margaret prepared to leave. As she hugged Eleanor goodbye, she held on a moment longer than usual. "What's that for?" Eleanor asked. "I'm just proud of you," Margaret said simply. "When Frank died, I worried you'd wither away up here all alone. Instead, you found a new purpose, something meaningful and important, something that might change how people see these animals for generations to come." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Maggie. You've been my rock through all of this." After Margaret left, Eleanor spent the remainder of the day in quiet reflection. She sat on her porch, watching Shadow as he moved about his territory, thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. From that first frightening morning when she'd discovered him on her porch to now, planning for the return of the cubs he had entrusted to her care. It seemed like a dream. As twilight settled over the mountains, Shadow returned to the cabin, taking his usual place on the porch. Eleanor had left the porch light off, allowing the stars to emerge in brilliant clarity above them. In the comfortable silence, she found herself talking to the bear as she often did in these quiet moments. "They're coming home soon," she told him softly. "Hope and Faith. They've grown so much, you might not recognize them. But I think they'll remember you." Shadow turned his head toward her, those intelligent eyes reflecting the starlight. Eleanor had long since stopped questioning whether he understood her words. There was a connection between them that transcended language, a bond formed through mutual trust and shared purpose. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she continued. "Both of us alone, both of us grieving in our own way. And now look at us, at the center of a scientific breakthrough, with a family of sorts." The word family caught in her throat. She hadn't realized until she said it aloud how much these bears had come to mean to her. After losing Frank, after accepting that they would never have children, Eleanor had resigned herself to solitude. Now, in her 70s, she had found a different kind of family, unconventional, unprecedented, but no less real for its strangeness. A week later, the day of the cubs' arrival dawned clear and warm. Eleanor had barely slept, her anticipation too great for rest. She was up before sunrise, making final preparations and watching for Shadow, who had been unusually absent since the previous afternoon. "Where are you?" she murmured, scanning the tree line. She had grown accustomed to his regular presence and felt a flicker of worry at his absence. By mid-morning, Dr. Chen arrived with her team and the transport vehicle containing Hope and Faith. The cubs, no longer truly cubs but adolescent bears, were sedated for the journey to minimize stress. As the team carefully moved them to the enclosure, Eleanor continued to watch for Shadow. "Is something wrong?" Dr. Chen asked, noticing her distraction. "Shadow's gone missing," Eleanor explained. I haven't seen him since yesterday. Dr. Chen frowned. That's unusual based on the patterns we've documented. But he is a wild bear. Perhaps he's found a new food source or is exploring his territory. Eleanor nodded, though she couldn't shake her concern. This didn't feel like normal behavior for Shadow, who had been almost vigilant in his presence as the preparations for the cub's arrival progressed. The introduction went smoothly despite Shadow's absence. Hope and Faith were placed in the enclosure and monitored as they woke from sedation. They appeared calm and curious about their new surroundings, exploring the space and finding the food caches that had been prepared for them. "They look wonderful," Eleanor said, watching through the observation window of the research station. "So healthy and strong." "They've come a long way," Dr. Chen agreed. "It's hard to believe these are the same fragile creatures we found in your storm cellar." As the day progressed and Shadow still didn't appear, Eleanor's worry deepened. By evening, when the research team had departed and she was alone again, she found herself pacing the porch, scanning the darkening forest for any sign of him. "Where are you?" she called into the gathering dusk. "They're here. Hope and Faith are back." Only silence answered her. Eleanor slept fitfully that night, waking often to check the windows for Shadow's familiar form. By morning, with still no sign of him, she decided to take action. Despite Dr. Chen's warnings about venturing into the forest alone, Eleanor packed a small backpack with water, a first aid kit, and her cell phone, and set out to search for her missing friend. She started with the area Shadow frequented most, the stream where he often fished, the berry patches he favored, the sunny clearing where he sometimes napped during warm afternoons. There was no sign of him in any of these places, though she found tracks indicating he had passed through recently. As the morning wore on, Eleanor ventured further from her property than she had in years. The forest was alive with spring activity. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects humming. Under different circumstances, she would have reveled in the vibrant renewal of life around her. Now she was focused solely on finding Shadow. It was nearly noon when she heard it, a low, distressed moan coming from a densely wooded ravine ahead. Eleanor's heart raced as she carefully picked her way down the steep slope, calling Shadow's name softly. There, at the bottom of the ravine, lay Shadow. He was alive but clearly injured, his right front paw caught in the cruel metal teeth of an illegal trap. Blood matted his fur, and his eyes, usually so alert, were dulled with pain. "Oh, Shadow," Eleanor gasped, approaching carefully. "What happened to you?" The bear lifted his head weakly at the sound of her voice, recognition flickering in his gaze. He made no move to rise or to pull away as she knelt beside him, examining the trap. It was an old but effective design, its serrated jaws clamped tightly around Shadow's paw. Such traps had been banned in most areas due to their cruelty, but some still used them in remote regions where enforcement was difficult. Eleanor felt a surge of anger at the thought of someone deliberately setting such a device in the forest. "I'm going to help you," she promised, pulling out her phone to call for assistance. But as she had feared, there was no signal in the ravine. She would have to handle this herself. Eleanor had seen Frank remove similar traps during his years as a forest ranger. She knew the mechanism, the release lever that would open the jaws, but also knew the strength required to operate it might be beyond her aging muscles. Still, she had to try. "This is going to hurt," she warned Shadow, positioning herself to access the trap. "But I need you to stay still." As if understanding, Shadow remained motionless as Eleanor applied her weight to the release lever. It resisted, rusted from exposure to the elements. Eleanor strained, using all her strength, but the mechanism barely moved. "Come on," she muttered through gritted teeth, repositioning for better leverage. This time she felt the lever give slightly, but not enough to release the jaws. Eleanor sat back, catching her breath and considering her options. Shadow watched her, his trust evident despite his pain. She couldn't fail him, not after everything they had been through together. Finding a sturdy branch nearby, Eleanor wedged it through the mechanism to create additional leverage. Then, bracing herself, she pushed down with all her might. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a loud snap, the trap's jaws sprang open. Shadow pulled his injured paw free immediately, then lay still, exhausted from pain and blood loss. Eleanor gently examined the wound. Deep punctures and lacerations, but no broken bones that she could detect. She used water from her pack to clean the injury as best she could, then wrapped it loosely with a bandage from her first aid kit. "We need to get you home," she said, looking up at the steep ravine walls. "But I don't think either of us can climb out of here without help." Shadow's response surprised her. Despite his injury, he rose shakily to his feet, swaying slightly but maintaining his balance. Then, with deliberate care, he moved to the least steep section of the ravine and began to climb, using his 3 uninjured paws to navigate the rough terrain. "Wait for me," Eleanor called, hurrying to follow. Together they made their slow, painful ascent. An elderly woman and a wounded bear, each compensating for the other's limitations. When Eleanor slipped on loose stones, Shadow paused, providing a stable presence beside her. When Shadow struggled to find footing with his injured paw, Eleanor guided him to firmer ground. It took nearly an hour to reach the top of the ravine, both of them stopping frequently to rest. Once on level ground, Eleanor oriented herself toward home, gauging they were about 2 miles from her cabin. Under normal circumstances, an easy walk. Now, with Shadow injured and her own energy flagging, it seemed a formidable journey. "One step at a time," she encouraged, as much for herself as for Shadow. Their progress was slow but steady. Shadow limped along beside Eleanor, occasionally leaning against her when his strength wavered. Eleanor found herself talking continuously, partly to distract them both from pain and fatigue, partly because it seemed to help Shadow focus on moving forward rather than his injury. "Hope and Faith are waiting," she told him. "They've grown so much. Faith is the adventurous one, always the first to try new foods or explore new areas. Hope is more cautious, more watchful, like you in that way." As they neared her property, Eleanor heard voices calling her name. Dr. Chen had returned for a scheduled check on the cubs and, finding Eleanor missing, had organized a search party. When they spotted Eleanor emerging from the forest with the injured Shadow, their relief quickly turned to concern. "What happened?" Dr. Chen asked, rushing to meet them. "Are you all right?" "He was caught in an illegal trap," Eleanor explained, her voice tight with fatigue and anger. "I managed to release him, but his paw needs proper treatment." Dr. Chen quickly assessed the situation, calling for her medical kit and directing her team to prepare a treatment area. "We'll need to sedate him," she told Eleanor. "The wound needs thorough cleaning and possibly stitches." Eleanor nodded, then knelt beside Shadow, who had finally collapsed from exhaustion. "They're going to help you," she whispered, stroking his head gently. "I'll be right here the whole time." As Dr. Chen prepared the sedative, Eleanor continued speaking softly to Shadow. "You found me when I needed help," she reminded him. "And I found you. That's what family does." Shadow's eyes, clouded with pain but still alert, held hers as the sedative took effect. Then they closed, his massive body relaxing as he surrendered to unconsciousness and the healing hands that would restore him. Eleanor's story of unexpected friendship with Shadow reminds us that life's most profound connections can emerge when we least expect them. In our golden years, when society often makes us feel invisible, this tale speaks to what our hearts know to be true. We never outgrow our capacity for purpose, courage, and love. Like Eleanor, many of us face challenges, health concerns, financial worries, or the heartache of loss. Yet within these struggles lie opportunities for remarkable new beginnings. Her willingness to trust her instincts despite others' doubts mirrors the wisdom that comes with our years. The bond between this elderly woman and wild bear transcends conventional boundaries, showing that companionship and meaning can take surprising forms at any age. Have you ever experienced an unexpected connection that brought new purpose to your life? Or perhaps, like Eleanor, have you found yourself standing up for something important when others thought you were being foolish? We'd love to hear your stories of unexpected joy or purpose found later in life. Please share your experiences in the comments below.